I'm delighted to be here. I'm here because Linda Rochester invited me, and anyone who is fool enough to not adhere to what Linda requests probably isn't around very much. It is a privilege to be here. This is a part of the county where the subject of my talk today, Justice Black, spent his summers often at Hatchet Creek. Back then he claims he could catch eel out of the creeks, which I have had no one else verify, but since there weren't all that many people doing that back in the 1890s who are still around, it's hard to figure that one out, true or false. This is a part of the county that has a big, rich history. I think in the political history, this was the part of the county where the National Grange, which was a farmers' organization that tried to organize farmers to deal with the problems of cheap cotton and high fertilizer. And it reminded me, thinking about that the National Grange was open to everybody, even non-farmers, except for three sorts of folks. They did not permit thieves, for obvious reasons. You don't want people stealing from you if you're part of the group. The second group they did not permit were actors, because you never could quite tell when an actor was telling you the truth or lying to you. And the third group, John, I hate to tell you, was lawyers. And the reason was they had the worst traits of the other two groups. I remembered that because Justice Black actually did not have a high opinion of the legal profession itself. He never belonged to the Alabama Bar Association, for example. He never belonged to the American Bar Association. And the reason was, as in his words, there were too many lawyers who were attorneys for revenue only. Too many lawyers who were attorneys for revenue only. He saw a higher calling in the profession that he didn't think enough folks responded to. And I think, I remember one of his clerks who went to practice law in New York remembered that and wrote him a note that I saw in the Library of Congress's archives where his papers are kept. And he wrote to the judge and said, "Judge, did you know that New York State has more lawyers per capita than any other state in the country? And that New Jersey has more waste dumps per capita than any other state in the country. And do you know why?" And the next paragraph of the letter said, "That's because New Jersey got first choice." He had a very nice sense of humor, and I think probably part of that came from his reflections on what it meant to try to have the courage and the drive to recreate the world as he thought it ought to be. He loved the South so much, he wanted to make it better. And that's quite a tribute. Since Alabama was granted statehood in 1819, only one person, born and reared in Alabama, has ever held a national office established by the United States Constitution. Only one person. And that person was Hugo L. Black, who served on the United States Supreme Court from 1937 to 1971. And Black was born, reared, and came of age in this place, this county of Clay. This special distinction highlights Hugo Black's place in the annals of Alabama history. And it raises the question, what was it about this place, this county, that helped Black achieve such a rare distinction in our national government? But in truth, this distinction vastly understates the role and influence that Justice Black had in shaping our nation as both a United States Senator and as a member of the United States Supreme Court. So this morning, with your permission, I want to remember briefly how Hugo Black helped to create the New Deal for all America, those national policies that were sustained and rescued the nation from the Great Depression, and how, as a member of the nation's highest court, Black helped to create what I call a constitutional America, a constitutional South, which entitled individuals with certain national rights that did not depend on a person's power, prestige, privilege, wealth, race, or religion. And then I want us to consider, what was it that Hugo Black drew from this place, from this county, from 1886, when his father welcomed his birth with a curse, until 1907, when after the Great Fire on the Ashland Town Square, he had to move to Birmingham, where he practiced law for the next 20 years. In other words, let's reflect on the Clay County origins of Hugo Black's political and judicial philosophy that guided his work and enabled his remarkable accomplishments. So Black was elected to the United States Senate in 1926 as a Democrat. And the animating concerns of his 11 years in the United States Senate can be summed up in 3 words: special corporate interests. One of the first bills that Senator Black introduced in the United States Senate was to ban public utility corporations from operating radio stations in the country. And soon he proposed the public registration of all lobbyists in Washington, something that had never been done. The people of this nation have suffered enough already from secret propaganda and fraudulent lobbies, often created by corporate interests, Black told his colleagues of the Senate in 1929. According to Black, President Herbert Hoover attempted to place the federal government under the control of large, unresponsive corporations, by appointing corporate lawyers and corporate officials to run the government. And once Franklin Roosevelt became president, Hugo Black became the South's most ardent supporter of the New Deal in the United States Senate. And he often wanted to go much further and much faster than President Roosevelt was willing to go in reshaping America. While representing Alabama, Hugo Black proposed a mandatory 30-hour work week during the Great Depression to spread wages across to more people to get them out of desperate poverty. He proposed in the 1930s a national health insurance. He proposed financing Social Security not through the workers' pay deduction, but through a tax on excessive wealth in the country. And he proposed the massive federal funding of public schools, more than had ever been proposed in the history of the nation. And he made various proposed amendments pushing the redistribution of wealth in this country through tax policies. When greed and privilege grasp unearned wealth and condemn millions to undeserved poverty and misery, government is useless if it does not curb greed and destroy privilege, Black said. During his Senate years, Black cleared the way for the passage of legislation that broke apart the nation's largest monopolies and was sponsor of the law that established for the first time a national minimum wage for workers. President Roosevelt appointed Black to the United States Supreme Court in 1937. Less than 4 months after joining that court, Justice Black wrote a dissenting opinion in a case in which he stated, and I quote, "I do not believe the word person in the 14th Amendment includes corporations." Certainly, when the 14th Amendment was submitted for approval, the people were not told that the states ratified an amendment granting new and revolutionary powers to corporations. This amendment sought to prevent discrimination by the states against classes and races, not corporations. 10 years later, Justice Black wrote another dissenting opinion that would become the revolutionary vision for establishing individual rights for all in the United States. In that dissent, he wrote, "The first 10 amendments were proposed and adopted largely because of fear that government might unduly interfere with prized individual liberties. This court has said that it could not hold that the first 8 amendments of the Constitution apply to the states. My study, the study of someone who didn't graduate from high school, my study of the historical events persuades me that one of the chief objects was to make the Bill of Rights applicable to the states." Now, lest we forget, in the lingering aftermath of the Great Depression, the United States was at a very precarious juncture in its history. New Deal reforms like Social Security and workers' compensation and others which we assume today were vastly popular, were in jeopardy in 1937 because of a one-vote majority on the Supreme Court that generally had held that they did not believe the Constitution invested the President or the Congress with the broad powers to be able to regulate commerce and business. In fact, the court had struck down most of the federal laws it had reviewed involving the New Deal before Hugo Black came to the court. Those were laws attempting to protect workers, children, and others simply too powerful, or too powerless, or too vulnerable to protect themselves. Also at this time, we must remember that the United States had very few enforced national standards of liberty and justice. Stubborn, prejudicial localism had made many state and local officials a law unto themselves. It was a government of men, not a government of law. For years, the nation's highest court had restricted the Bill of Rights and its protections only against some excesses and some abuses, and only against the excesses and abuses of federal officials, not from the abuses of state and local officials, who were far more numerous. Now, what that meant is that the freedom to speak, the freedom to pray to one's own God, too often depended on a person's place, race, income, nationality, or religion. And across the land, there was crude discrimination of all sorts, openly flourishing, while the court and the rest of America at that time looked away from our own region of the South, where we were sustaining a brutal system of segregation. Justice Black's arrival on the Supreme Court marked a turning point away from that America, towards ratifying the national government's role and capacity to take care of its own people when they are in need, and to begin to establish a constitutional America, built for the first time on the recognition that all individuals in this country, all persons, have inalienable rights, regardless of the accidents of birth. Now, across most of his 34 years on the nation's highest court, Justice Black worked tirelessly to affirm the principles of the New Deal, that the national government had the constitutional powers, and he believed the obligation, to help eradicate and prevent what he called undeserved poverty and misery, and to establish a constitutional America where the Constitution would outlaw racial segregation and enforce the Bill of Rights against government encroachment, no matter how poor, no matter how much of a pauper, no matter where you lived or what you did. And during this period, Justice Black also became the nation's fiercest advocate for a free press, although the fact of the matter is he didn't trust the press very much at all. But he became the fiercest advocate for a free press without any prior restraint and for the other freedoms of the First Amendment. He believed deeply that the Constitution allowed all ideas to compete in order to preserve the free minds of this country. As he wrote in 1961, the freedom of speech, press, petition, and assembly, guaranteed by the First Amendment, must be accorded to the ideas we hate, or sooner or later they will be denied to the ideas we cherish. Joined by others on the Supreme Court, Justice Black had a singular role in creating this constitutional framework for affirming the expansive powers of the federal government to deal with its people's problems, the economic problems of its people, and the basic issues of social injustice, and incorporating the Bill of Rights into the law of the land, governing every town, every city, every hamlet, and even every crossroads. And along the way, given this constitutional America, given the powers of government to deal with the people's problems, the United States of America vastly expanded individual rights and human productivity and became, during this period, the richest nation on earth. We should remember also that while Justice Black's role in shaping the law was enormous, his own judicial philosophy as to how he understood and interpreted the Constitution itself was never embraced by a majority of the members of the Supreme Court. In other words, Black helped to convince a majority of the Supreme Court members to apply the Bill of Rights to local and state governments, but he did not convince them to adopt his judicial reasoning for doing it. Black led the Supreme Court in broadening the application of the First Amendment to assure that there was a freedom of speech, a freedom of press, a freedom of religion from government control, probably more than anyone in the history of the court. But no one justice has ever adopted Black's judicial belief that the exact words of the First Amendment include absolute prohibitions, as he believed, against abridging freedoms with no exceptions. Because Justice Black said, when Congress, it says Congress shall make no law, I think it means Congress shall make no law. It was an irony, not lost on Justice Black, especially in his later years, that as a judicial prophet, he was able to get many followers, but few converts. Nonetheless, looking over his 34 years on the court, it is without question that Hugo Black was the earliest prophet and the principal force for the United States Supreme Court to create, in our time, a constitutional America. Now, the origins of Hugo Black's political and judicial achievement, which helped to transform America in these ways, are found in no small measure here in Clay County. While identifying the origins of anyone's political, moral, or judicial philosophy is not an exact science, there is no DNA in history yet. My study of Hugo Black's life and times has led me to locate clearly the origins of his political and judicial philosophy not so much in his lifelong study of the writings of Thomas Jefferson and the Greeks, or his study of the United States history and the history of the Constitution, or his reading of prior Supreme Court decisions, but more in his experience in real-life understanding as they first emerged and consolidated here in Alabama, including his early years coming of age here in Clay County. In 1956, in an opinion for the Supreme Court, Justice Black wrote that the United States is a country dedicated to affording equal justice to all and special privilege to none. It is the only Supreme Court opinion in the history of the court that includes that term, equal justice to all and special privilege to none. It's not a phrase found in the United States Constitution or the Alabama Constitution or any other state constitution. But it was a figure of speech that young Hugo Black heard on the steps of the Clay County Courthouse in the 1890s when the local populace here in Clay County were competing with local Democrats in state politics. The more common expression, equal rights to all and special privilege to none, was the essential political slogan and philosophy of Clay County's populace of the 1890s. Clay County's Populist Party was not a simple movement, but at bottom it represented the first challenge of poor white farmers, and most folks were farmers, poor whites against reestablishing a Southern way of life based on the slave society that existed before the Civil War. As a practical matter, it was a protest of Alabama farmers suffering from the economic depression of 1890, when they demanded that local, state, and federal governments address the problems that they had. These farmers knew that the government could not control the weather, which oftentimes battered their crops, but they knew that the national government regulated banks and the nation's currency and controlled the price and demand for farm goods through tariffs and taxes. And as I wrote in Hugo Black of Alabama, while the courthouse could not mint silver dollars nor set the price of cotton, public officials in Ashland made critical decisions about who received the aid of tax monies, jobs, and education, how citizens' land and personal property were valued and taxed, and when and how to foreclose on liened property and crops. At the State House, Clay's representatives alone could decide which officials would get elected by local people and rather than be appointed by Montgomery's state officials. What were the rules and terms of the limits of the lien laws that could cause one to lose a farm or a house, and the stock laws that govern the grazing of cattle? Equal rights or equal justice to all. It was the populist concept that essentially meant just what it says, that each person has equal standing and equal protection in a democracy. The other part of the phrase, special privilege to none, challenged what populists saw as a system controlled by corporate self-interests. Those corporations and wealthy who the populists believed rigged the democratic process to unfairly benefit themselves. Hugo Black's family was split down the middle on these political issues. His father, W.L. Black, a local merchant, and other members of his extended family were Democrats, but many of his mother's relatives, especially the Tolands, were populists. Young Hugo did not blindly accept the arguments of the populists or the Democrats. But here in Clay, he was exposed to a real competition of political ideas and ideals, and a serious young man listened. This competition of ideas was something far too rare throughout Alabama in its one-party political history. Clearly, over the decades, Black not only remembered the political slogans he heard at the courthouse, but he also remembered what they meant. Hugo Black also spent a good deal of time at the Clay County Courthouse after his family moved from the Harlan community to Ashland in 1889, not just listening to political speeches, but going and watching the trials in the courthouse. It was where young Hugo heard lawyers arguing two sides of every issue. This little boy sat up front in the courtroom watching the lawyers trying the cases. And he was exposed to a competition of facts and ideas about what was right, what was wrong, who was guilty, who was innocent. In fact, it's reliably reported that young Hugo, even before he was a teenager, sat in the front row of the courtroom, not merely listening to testimony, but sitting there assessing, judging, if you will, who he thought was making the best arguments and who he thought was performing the most effective role as competing attorneys. And he also occasionally decided the judge was wrong. The schools were another important institution in the life of Clay County and in Ashland at that time. And the schools that Black attended had a curriculum that emphasized self-improvement and the competition of differing ideas. Almost every boy at Ashland Academy, including Hugo, was required to participate in a debate team and in speaking contests against others, where they competed with ideas as teenagers. Now, they may have argued more about questions that Professor Evans put to them about the ancient Romans or the Greeks than the populists and the Democrats. But that schooling required young Hugo to think for himself about what were strong and valid ideas and ideals, and of course, how to persuasively present those beliefs that he held. The church was, of course, the third major institution in the life of Clay County as Hugo Black came of age, and it too had a real influence in shaping Black's philosophy and his approach to the Constitution when he became an adult later in life. Hugo's father was expelled from the Baptist church near Harlan by a vote of the congregation due to W.L. Black's public taste for alcohol. But Hugo's mother, Ardella, was an active, devout, traditional Baptist congregant who believed both in the primary role of Sunday schools and who believed in the Baptist tradition that no preacher, but each person was responsible for understanding and interpreting the Bible for herself. In those days, ministers were circuit riders who preached at different towns on different Sundays. And it was the women of the church who kept it up and who every Sunday taught the Sunday school. The Bible was the first book that Hugo Black read. He actually read it cover to cover twice during his youth. His mother quizzed him on what he thought the different words and verses meant. To please his mother, young Hugo attended church services of whichever circuit riding preacher was in town that Sunday, Baptist, Methodist, and even occasionally Presbyterian. And most weeks he attended not just the Baptist Sunday school, but he also went to the Methodist Sunday school. There was no cable television then. In this environment, young Hugo was not taught simply one set of religious beliefs. He was not taught one interpretation of biblical scripture, but he was exposed to a range of differing religious perspectives and taught by his dear mother to examine for himself those perspectives and especially to consider for himself what each word of the Bible meant. And of course, he was also exposed to the skepticism and sarcasm of a father who lost his faith over alcohol and never set foot in a church again after he was expelled for drunkenness until he died and his wife put him into the Baptist cemetery. Of course, this confluence of conditions and factors that were part of Black's early days in Clay County could have and were lost on young persons who did not possess the deep sense of self-assurance about his place in the world, even if in the case of young Hugo at that time, his world did not extend any further than Alex City. This self-confidence was probably in large measure a result of the upbringing by an intelligent, caring mother in a community where children had the opportunity to be bored and to safely explore their own independence of action and belief on their own. To be sure, late in life, responding to an old friend, Justice Black said that he believed much of his own character came from his early days spent, in his words, with the sturdy people of Clay County. His detractors, however, saw Black's self-assurance as a sense of self-importance, which is why, once Hugo went to Birmingham and began collecting political and legal opponents, they started referring not to Hugo Black, but to Ego Black. Despite these distractions, perhaps the clearest indication that Hugo Black understood how much he owed Clay County is evident in the fact that in 1926, having once been elected by the people of Jefferson County to public office, Hugo Black returned to this county, to Clay County, to open his campaign for the United States Senate. It might have been a much smarter move politically for Black to claim Jefferson County as his home in 1926 because it had 14 times more votes than Clay County did. But Black decided, in his words, to come home to Clay County. So let's remember those words spoken that day as he stood on the balcony of the Clay County Courthouse, the one that still stands, with the Lady of Justice holding the scales atop that building. It was a long speech, and I'm not going to go through it all. But I am going to recall those parts that I think reveal the basic terms of his political and judicial philosophy as of 1926, at the age of 40, with about 40 years having spent in Alabama, and almost 40 years would then thereafter be spent in Washington, where he shaped the nation. These are Hugo Black's words on the steps of the courthouse. My friends and neighbors, the soil on which I stand is sacred to me. Only a few hundred yards away reposes the ashes of my father, who cherished hopes of my success, and the mother whose worn and wrinkled hand pointed away, every way, to truth and light and faith. When I was on a farm in Clay County, Alabama, 20 miles from the nearest railroad, my father was struggling with rocky soil and high-priced fertilizer in an effort to grow just enough cheap cotton to purchase the very necessities of life, made dear by unjust tariffs and unjust laws permitting organized manufacturers to exploit unorganized farmers. I have come home to make to you, my boyhood friends and neighbors, my first profession of political faith. I have held no great office. I am not now and never have been a railroad, power company, or corporation lawyer. They have never shaped my ideals, fashioned my political creed, nor helped me in my aspirations for public office. I am not a millionaire. I am not a coal operator. My father was not a United States Senator, and I'm not running on his record. I have no hereditary claim to office. If the time has come when public office goes to the highest bidder, I lift my voice in vain. I could not compete with millionaire opponents on an advertising or money-spending campaign. I would not if I could. I do not believe that the people want a United States Senator who is willing to buy the help of political parasites and machine politicians. Wealth is piling up in the hands of a few with ever-increasing power. But a country, in the final analysis, is no more prosperous than the great masses of its citizens. I oppose the idea that the way to benefit the masses is to shift tax burdens from the rich to the poor. I am not opposed to wealth, honestly acquired, honestly used. Equality under the law to millionaire and pauper, factory owner and worker is the test of a successful democracy. Equal rights for all and special privilege to none. We must turn a deaf ear alike to the selfish appeals of those who attack property rights or human rights. The golden rule of life should be the golden rule of politics and business. It is my conception that the representative of a great people in the age-old struggle between those who have and those who want is to hold the scales of justice evenly. Yes, Black said, the great goal of democracy is universal equity. The vision I see shines from justice to all and special privilege to none. When freedom was wrestled, Black continued, from King George III by the homespun-clad soldiers of the Revolution, they sought to put a perpetual barrier against plutocracy and hereditary succession. The youth of America have been inspired to place their feet on the ladder of ambition. We have taxed the people to build schools in order that the sons and daughters of the poor and obscure might have the chances in life with the sons and daughters of the rich and the powerful. This is the boast of America. Whatever may be your verdict at the polls, Black said, I ask the fathers and mothers who love their children to strike at this idea that only the rich, only the powerful, only the sons of the great can serve this state. It is true now that the humblest son of the humblest citizen, born in the humblest surroundings, can lift his eyes towards the star of hope. Such is the spirit of America. So said Hugo Black at the Clay County Courthouse in 1926. And so did Hugo Black reveal the inheritance he had received in good measure by coming of age in this county. May that spirit of America that he proclaimed here and took to Washington to shape our national life continue to grow in this place and in our time, so that a government of laws will function, in the words of Hugo Black, for the benefit of every human being, subject to our Constitution, of whatever race, creed, or persuasion. Thanks for listening.